Hi, hello, good evening, and welcome to our first, I hope, in a long series of climate conversations. This event comes in response to the urgency of the ongoing climate breakdown and the sluggish response to this crisis by almost everyone, from international organizations to national governments to large corporations to universities and arts institutions. In initiating this conversation about climate change and the arts, I wanted to create an event that is, to borrow art historian Lucy Lippard's apt phrase, alarming but not alarmist. Climate change is a game changer for everyone: sciences, politics, economy, and the arts. In response to this crisis, some theaters have been inviting scientists, artists, and activists to address the issues of climate change in direct conversations with each other and with the audience. Some of them have been approaching these kinds of encounters as a sort of documentary theater and not as panels or talks. So, to hell with originality. That is a great model worth replicating and pursuing. It is important to note that while independently organized, this event is embedded into our department, Theater and Performance Studies developmental stage season. Symbolically, it is essential that this conversation does not come on top of our artistic activities, but that it is integrated into our creative and production program. In that sense, it is not an addition to the season, but a call for transformation of the ways in which we think about art, artistic representation, and the role of performance in our society. I am very grateful to Stanford Art Institute for their support for this event and to Stanford Arts, which joined TAPS as a co-producers. One of our goals is to foster a dialogue between members of Stanford faculty and guests from across the fields that are engaging in research on climate change. I can hardly imagine two better interlocutors than our guests tonight. So please let me just briefly introduce our guests in alphabetical order. To the left is T.J. Demos. He's the Patricia and Roland Rebelli Endowed Chair in Art History in the Department of the History of Art and Visual Culture at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and founding director of its Center for Creative Ecologies. Demos is the author of several books, including Against the Anthropocene, Visual Culture and Environment Today, Decolonizing Nature, Contemporary Art and the Politics of Ecology, The Migrant Image, The Art and Politics of Documentary During Global Crisis, which is the winner of College Art Association 2014 Frank Jewett Mather Award, and Return to the Post-Colony, Specters of Colonialism in Contemporary Art. He recently co-edited really an amazing collection, the Routledge Companion on Contemporary Art, Visual Culture and Climate Change, was a Getty Research Institute Fellow, and directed the Mellon-funded Sawyer Seminar Research Project Beyond the End of the World. Demos was chair and chief curator of the Climate Collective, providing public programming related to 2021 Climate Emergence program at the Museum of Art, Architecture and Technology in Lisbon. His new book, Radical Futurisms, Ecologies of Collapse, Chronopolitics and Justice to Come, is now out from Sternberg Press in Berlin. To my right is Professor Mark Z. Jacobson, Director of the Atmosphere Energy Program and Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering here at Stanford. He is also a Senior Fellow of the Woods Institute for the Environment and the Precor Center of Energy. His career focuses on better understanding air pollution and global warming problems and developing large-scale clean, renewable energy solutions to them. He has published 6 books, including his latest, No Miracles Needed, and about 180 peer-reviewed journal articles. He is ranked as the #1 most impactful scientist in the world in the field of meteorology and atmospheric sciences, and number 6 in the field of energy among those publishing past 1985. He received the 2005 American Meteorological Society Henry G. Houghton Award and the 2013 American Geophysical Union Ascent Award for his work on black carbon climate impact, and the 2013 Global Green Policy Design Award for developing state and country energy plans. In 2015, he received a Cosarelli Prize from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences for his work on the grid integration of 100% wind, water, and solar energy systems. In 2018, he received the Judy Friedman Lifetime Achievement Award for distinguished career dedicated to funding solutions to large-scale air pollution and climate problems. Should I go on, Mark?
That's enough.
On a more fun part, Mark was on. David Letterman has collaborated with Mark Ruffalo and Zoe Saldana. He gave TED Talks, and his work is the scientific basis of the energy portion of the U.S. Green New Deal and laws to go to 100% renewable energy in cities, states, and countries worldwide. So please welcome TJ Demos and Mark Jacobson. So we're going to have a very simple format tonight. I'm going to ask TJ and Mark to give their opening statements, roughly 10 minutes, about their work and where do they see themselves and the world going with the climate. After they're done, we're also going in alphabetical order, so TJ will go first and then Mark. I will get them started with a question addressing both of them. They will engage in a conversation, and at one point we'll open it up for audience questions. So basically, no one envisions this as a debate, but as an exchange of ideas, views, and strategies. So with that, why don't you get us started, TJ?
All right, great. Thank you, Branislav. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm honored to be in conversation with Mark, whose work I followed for a while and really respect. So I'm really happy to participate in this conversation. Often, in my experience, the arts and humanities, where I'm really based in terms of my research and teaching, does not often come into direct conversation with engineering and sciences and technology studies. So it's really an interesting encounter and has lots of, I think, potential and really is necessary increasingly to do these days. So with that said, I brought some images. I realized that you probably can't see this very well. We hoped to have a bigger screen, but it just wasn't possible in this room. So forgive me, but just for those of you who can make it out, it provides some visual reference for what I'll talk about briefly, which is my most recent book that Branislav mentioned, Radical Futurisms, Ecologies of Collapse, Chronopolitics, and Justice to Come, which gives you a sense of how I'm approaching climate questions, ecological questions from within my area of the arts, the humanities, environmental research, as well as activism and political organizing. So I'm bringing that kind of experiential background to these questions. So for me, when we hear that we're in a climate emergency, as we've been hearing from many different sources for the last few years, the crucial question is, who is the we, right? Who is included in this question of climate emergency, which also begs the question, what is the emergency and what is the climate, right? If we listen to groups that really emphasize social justice and that framework in addressing climate questions, the emergency isn't necessarily in the near future. It's in the past, maybe even 500 years ago, in terms of the colonization of the Americas. That was itself a kind of climate apocalypse experienced by many indigenous peoples as something that these days, when they hear that we're in a climate emergency, they ask, well, welcome to the club, right? We've been there for generations. So I know you can't read this, but I'll just read this out loud because it's a good quote coming from this group called Wretched of the Earth, named after the Frantz Fanon book. It's a coalition of climate justice organizations. And they say, our communities have been on fire for a long time, and these flames are fanned by our exclusion and silencing. Without incorporating our experiences, this is really awkward to have to read like this, but any response to the disaster will fail to change the complex ways in which social, economic, and political systems shape our lives, offering some an easy pass in life, making others pay the cost. In order to envision a future in which we will all be liberated from the root causes of the climate crisis, capitalism, extractivism, racism, sexism, classism, ableism, and other systems of oppression, the climate movement must reflect the complex realities of everyone's lives in their narrative. So that's Wretched of the Earth. It's a really crucial perspective for me that's informed lots of my approaches. So with that, in my work, I tend to be quite critical of some approaches to geoengineering, for instance, and technological-based solutions if they don't take into account questions of equity and justice and social justice within their proposals. So, for instance, all the work on geoengineering, which maybe, I don't know, maybe we'll get into that. For me, I view more as a kind of technofix that enables the perpetuation of systems of inequality and injustice to continue. So that does not mean that I'm against technology or using engineering approaches. I think they're absolutely necessary. But the main emphasis is how can we integrate those approaches with a social justice-based analysis. So that when we hear approaches to futurity or visions of sustainability into the future proposed by a billionaire technology class, from Zuckerberg to Elon Musk, we have to question these proposals from the vantage point of histories of colonization, histories of racial slavery, histories of oppression and inequality that continue into our present. In many ways, I would argue we're already living in an emergency, and it's an emergency where we're surrounded by the rubble of these fantasies by billionaire technologists and the space race that's going on these days. For instance, when Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook proposes this vision for a virtual future with the metaverse and puts some $36 billion into that venture, which ends up failing just a few years later. If any of you saw some recent reports, including a really interesting Guardian article on that, I think, I have to ask the question, like, what would be the situation if we were able to have a more transparent, democratic, and equitable discussion of where those kinds of resources might go to address already ongoing emergencies these days. So people like Melanie Yazzie of the Red Nation, dedicated to indigenous decolonization, argue that indigenous peoples have been at the forefront of climate justice since 1492. I think that's really important to bring into the picture when we're talking about climate emergency. So this is stuff that I bring up in my book, Radical Futurisms, where I'm looking at different approaches to thinking about futurity from different traditions of people who have been historically oppressed, including indigenous peoples, leading into visions, experimental creative representations of indigenous futurisms, or all sorts of approaches to thinking about futurity that escape the kind of alarmism that Branislav was mentioning in his intro, right? It's really important, I think, to try to resist the catastrophism of the present, the kind of profound negativity that's very easy for us to get sucked up into, and try to commit to realizing positive transformation. So when it comes to proposals for transformation, again, how can we bring a social justice framework to that, to those proposals? How can we turn a transition into a just transition? That would be something that I'm really interested in asking, along with many artists who are dealing increasingly with climate, ecology, these kinds of questions of environmentalism, but again, refusing a narrow definition of climate, where it's just a matter of, for instance, carbon in the atmosphere instead of powers on the ground. Like a group such as Black Quantum Futurism working in Philadelphia is asking questions about urban justice and futures that are anti-gentrification. How can we build futures of sustainability that are dedicated to anti-racism, meaningful inclusion, climate reparations, redistribution of resources? This is the kind of questions that Black Quantum Futurism and many other groups are asking. For instance, including diverse questions of space travel and space futures is something that is part of the very creative, speculative approach of many artists to these questions that I'm interested in, including the London-based collective called the Autolith Group, which has done, they've done a lot of really interesting projects looking at this term, the Anthropocene, right, where we've geologists and other science studies and environmental humanities researchers are arguing that we've entered this new phase of geological history where human systems are driving geological transformation. So we're in the Anthropocene these days. The Autolith Group brings a critical perspective to this and argues against the kind of hidden anthropocentrism that sometimes goes along with that term, and also the generalization of a subject position that ignores long histories of racialization, of colonization. And so they respond to the Anthropocene with other kinds of terms, including, for instance, the racial capitalocene, as another, perhaps more accurate descriptor of conditions of environmental transformation that take into account those long histories of climate transformation beginning in, say, 1492. Just wrapping it up, I'm also really interested in artists recently who have been turning to what we might call the arts of organizing. Like, how can we not only imagine emancipatory futures and climate just transitions, but also work toward realizing them? What would that look like? How can the arts contribute to organizing politically to enact transformations, which means coming up against entrenched powers that keep us locked within conditions of the status quo? So artists like Jonas Staal within the European context, he's a Dutch artist, is doing really interesting work in terms of his project called Training for the Future. How can we train for futures that are different from the present? How can we train for futures of emancipation, of justice, of sustainability, where we ask, what are we sustaining exactly and why? Right? These are critical questions that go beyond mere, that try to bring the biogeophysical together with the sociopolitical, right? That would be more of a justice-based framework to climate transformation. Finally, artists are also involved in thinking critically about institutions. Like, how can we begin to address climate issues from a justice-based framework when the institutions in which we're operating are funded by billionaires or are directed by CEOs of major corporations that are invested in fossil fuel funding, right? There's inevitable consequences and ramifications for this. For instance, at the Whitney Museum in New York, what does it mean when someone who's the CEO of an arms manufacturer who manufactures tear gas is on the board of trustees? What kind of visions of climate justice can be developed and presented in that kind of institution? Similarly, at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, we have a range of people on the board of trustees there that have their hands within diverse sectors of what we might call fossil capitalism. So again, how can institutions be restructured or dismantled or reimagined so that they support more justice-based, redistributive, reparative models of climate futurity? I'll stop there. Thank you.
Mark.
It's a tough act to follow. So my work is on trying to understand and solve large-scale air pollution and climate problems through clean renewable energy systems. And I'm actually looking at it from not only solving the climate problem, but also addressing air pollution and energy security simultaneously. Worldwide, 7 million people die from air pollution, and hundreds of millions more are ill. Air pollution is the second leading cause of death worldwide, and 20% of the people who die are children under the age of 5 years old. And the same sources that cause air pollution also cause climate damage. That's namely combustion from fossil fuels and biofuels. And energy security, in addition to what climate problems are immediately and significant, just to put in perspective in terms of the air pollution problem, I mean, if we eliminate all emissions today from human sources, we can pretty much eliminate all these air pollution deaths and illnesses immediately. So we don't have 20 years, 50 years to solve the air pollution problem. I mean, in the last 100 years alone, there have been way over 100 million deaths from air pollution. I mean, we're talking enormous numbers of people are dying. But if we solve the emissions problem, we have an immediate benefit. The climate problem is something that is already significant in terms of the cost. I mean, just to put in perspective of cost, based on statistical cost of life and morbidity, air pollution costs the world on the order of $30 trillion per year today. And that's valuing life at about $3 million a person, which is that's the average worldwide of what governments, they value human life at. But, which is not necessarily, it's a pretty morbid statistic, but that's how it's done. And based on the social cost of carbon, which is the way economists also evaluate the damage due to climate change, which is real damage, such as the effects of higher sea level, droughts, floods, more air pollution due to higher temperatures, losses of agriculture, heat stroke, heat stress, and you name it, there are more and more problems, more extreme weather. Those costs are also are not even close to $30 trillion per year today, but are expected to be about $30 trillion per year by 2050. So that's, together those two problems will be $60 trillion per year. I mean, the world gross domestic product right now is about close to $90 trillion per year. So those are two problems that need to be solved immediately. The climate problem, we have, already we've had a global warming of about 1.2 degrees Celsius since the 1850 to 1900 period. And we've already seen a lot of impacts from that. We're trying to avoid 1.5 degrees global warming. And the only way we can do that is to eliminate 80% of all emissions by 2030 and 100% by 2050. And which is what I'm going to talk about today, how to do that. But it is feasible, but we do need rapid action. The third problem I'm trying to address simultaneously is energy security. I mean, fossil fuels are limited resources. They will run out over time. And when they do run out, that will result in energy cost instability, social instability, political instability, and could result in chaos and civil wars throughout the world. So we do need to change our energy infrastructure before we run out of fossil fuels, in addition to other energy security problems, such as the fact that that a lot of countries depend on other countries for their fuels. And that obviously results in conflict in cases, for example, right now in the war between Ukraine and Russia. But not only that, there are other types of energy insecurity. Just the fact that, Hawaii in the United States has the highest electricity prices. And why is that? By far, it's almost double the electricity price in the rest of the US. And that's because you have to transport fuel over long distance. In fact, island countries and territories have enormously high electricity prices. So there are lots of types of energy insecurity. Even another type of energy insecurity is the fact that when you have a lot of centralized power plants or refineries, when one goes down, that takes down a whole portion of a city or could be a country. And whereas if you can go to more distributed energy like wind and solar, where there's just lots of sources, lots of individual producers of electricity, that reduces the risk of an outage damaging a large section of the population. So these three problems all require immediate and drastic solutions. And the good news I want to bring out, I want to say something positive, because these are horrible problems and they're getting worse, they're not getting better. But I believe we do have a solution to these problems. We know how to solve these problems. And in fact, we have 95% of the solutions available technologically and economically today. It's really a question of not only implementing them on a large scale, but first of all, focusing on these solutions and not getting distracted with what I'll call all of the above solutions that do not help in solving these problems, in fact, hinder the solution. And the other thing is we need collective willpower among everybody, not only individuals, but combining companies, businesses, companies, governments, state and local governments, and national governments. All need to help in addition to individuals. So individuals can do things, communities can do things, businesses can do things, and governments of all different sizes can help to solve this problem. So what is the solution? Well, first of all, just to put in perspective, 75% to 80% of all climate relevant emissions are from energy, and about 90% of air pollution emissions are from energy. The emissions that are not from energy include open biomass burning, so that's like permanent deforestation, like burning down forests to replace them with agricultural land, or burning savanna, burning waste from agriculture. That causes a lot of air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, and not only greenhouse gas emissions, but also black carbon, which is the second leading cause of global warming. Black carbon is the main component of soot, which is that black smoke that comes out of diesel exhaust from trucks and buses and trains and other sources where you're burning diesel or kerosene or even jet fuel. That's dark smoke. When you can see it, that means it's absorbing sunlight, not allowing that sunlight to transmit. When it absorbs sunlight, it heats up and sends that heat to the air right around it. So particles such as black carbon, they heat the air directly, and whereas greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide or methane or nitrous oxide or ozone, they are relatively transparent to sunlight, and they absorb heat emitted by the surface of the earth. So greenhouse gases operate differently from soot particles. But soot particles, because they absorb sunlight directly and heat the air directly, they are much more powerful per unit mass than greenhouse gases at warming the air. In fact, a soot particle is 1,000,000 times more powerful than carbon dioxide per unit mass at warming the air. However, there's a lot less soot in the air than there is carbon dioxide. And that's why carbon dioxide is the leading cause of global warming, and causing about 45% of warming. And black carbon, and also what's called brown carbon, which is mostly organic carbon from similar sources, but other types of burning, where it's like brown smoke and yellow smoke. Brown and black carbon together cause about 15 to 20% of warming. Methane is third at about 10 to 15%, and then you have ozone and nitrous oxide and other greenhouse gases. But black carbon is not only a global warming agent, it's a particle that kills people when they breathe it, statistically. So I mentioned the 7 million air pollution deaths per year. Well, 90% of air pollution deaths worldwide are due to particles from air pollution, and soot is a particle component. And there are other types of particle components that cause massive health problems, including sulfate particles, ammonium-related particles, and nitrate-related particles, and others. But so controlling soot is very important, not only for slowing global warming, but also improving human health. Okay, so I mentioned one non-energy source of pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. There's also methane from agriculture, such as from the feedlots, from digestive tracts of cows and sheep, and also manure, such as chicken manure, pig manure, and cow manure. Also landfills. The methane comes from landfills. Any place where you have a lack of oxygen, you get methanogenic bacteria, which produce methane growing. You also get them in rice paddies. So methane is a big source that is not an energy-related source, although there is energy sources of methane. Nitrous oxide from fertilizer. Halogens, which used to be, chlorofluorocarbons, for example, used to be from spray cans and foam production and solvents. Chlorofluorocarbons have been largely banned, but they're all now these substitutes, which are like just fluorocarbons, and then hydrofluorocarbons, and there are other types of replacement compounds that are still used as refrigerants, and when they leak then they into the air, then they're actually strong global warming agents. So anyway, we have to address those simultaneously with the energy components. But I want to talk now about energy. What can we do? Well, we need to transition our energy infrastructure so we have to eliminate combustion. Combustion is the root of the problem of both air pollution and global warming. And it also, what are we combusting? Well, mostly fossil fuels, but also some biofuels. And the fossil fuels are obviously a major source of energy insecurity. So we want to transition our energy infrastructure to run primarily on clean renewable sources, such as what I call wind, water, and solar. So onshore and offshore wind, solar photovoltaics on rooftops and in power plants, concentrated solar power, geothermal electricity, and there's also geothermal heat, hydroelectricity, small amounts of tidal and wave power. Those are pretty much all we need worldwide to power the entire world for all purposes. So such a world will be primarily, it'll be 90% wind and solar, maybe 4% or so hydroelectric power, and the rest will be a mix. There'll be a mix of the rest. It'll be actually more than 90%, maybe 92 or 3% wind and solar. But we need also storage for because the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine. So we need electricity storage, heat storage, cold storage, and there's also hydrogen storage. First, I should just point out that, well, we're not only solving the problem for electricity. There are four main energy sectors. There's electricity, transportation, buildings, and industry. And electricity comprises about 20% of all the end-use energy that people use. So we need to address all of those sectors. And we can, because we can, if we electrify all energy sectors. So that's the key, is electrification of everything. So for vehicles, we want to go primarily to battery electric vehicles, but some hydrogen fuel cell for long-distance heavy transport, like long-distance aircraft, long-distance ships. But short-haul flights, for example, would be battery electric. In short-haul, trains, a lot of trains can be battery electric for short-haul, maybe hydrogen fuel cell for long-haul. Or trains, you could have electrified tracks, you can go longer. Or in ships, same thing. Short distance would be electric, long distance hydrogen fuel cell. And then for buildings, we want to electrify those, electric heat pumps for air heating, water heating, air conditioning, and even for dryers, use electric heat pump dryers. And also electric induction cooktops, LED lights, energy efficiency. Just get rid of all combustion in your home or commercial building. And so then in industry, we want to use high temperature industrial processes. There are existing technologies, electric arc furnaces, induction furnaces, resistance furnaces, dielectric heaters, electron beam heaters, heat pumps also for these high temperature processes. So we have, in fact, 95% of everything we need to transition all energy. And the key is to implement policies to do this as quickly as possible. Now, the thing is we don't want to focus on is we need to not focus on things that do not work very well, that either increase air pollution or increase or hardly reduce carbon or increase energy insecurity. And so I'm going to just say it right now, we do not want carbon capture for any purpose, direct air capture for any purpose, small modular nuclear reactors. We do not want bioenergy for any purpose. And we do not want electrofuels. We do not want blue hydrogen. We do not want geoengineering. And okay, so four of these, carbon capture, direct air capture, blue hydrogen, and electrofuels, are all constructs of the fossil fuel industry. They all keep the fossil fuel industry alive. Carbon capture is probably the biggest scheme there is. Just to give you an idea, there was one coal-fired power plant in the US that was fitted with carbon capture. That was the Parrish coal plant in Texas. It cost $1 billion. And what do? Just to put in context, carbon capture requires so much energy and it requires equipment. So this $1 billion was used to build a natural gas plant just to provide the electricity for the carbon capture equipment added to the coal plant. So they built a natural gas plant, and that natural gas plant, you had to build pipelines and mine new gas or new fracking wells, transport the gas, and there's a lot of leakage of methane or natural gas from that, and none of that's captured. Transport the gas eventually to the natural gas facility. where it was used to produce electricity. None of the carbon dioxide or air pollution from that natural gas facility was captured. Carbon capture was added to the coal plant, but it only captured 55%, not 90% or 95% of the carbon dioxide from the coal stack emissions the first year, 65% averaged over 3 years. Didn't capture any of the carbon from mining of the coal. So you had more natural gas mined, still had coal mining, you had all this emissions from the natural gas plant, and you only captured a portion of the CO2 from the coal plant. And what do they do with the CO2? They piped it to an oil field to bind it with the oil, and when that happens, the oil becomes less dense, and they can actually extract more oil from the added carbon dioxide. But that process emits 40% or causes 40% of the carbon dioxide that was captured to go right back to the air. And so the whole process, before even accounting for what was lost, the capture rate over a 20-year time frame was 11%. And then taking another 40% off, it's really about a 7% capture rate over 3 years. This thing was such a boondoggle, they shut it after 3 years, and so it closed down. And who was paying this $1 billion bill? Well, the ratepayers and the highest people who pay the highest fraction of their income for electricity are those who have the least income. And so this is just one example, but direct air capture is the same. It takes energy, and that energy, even if it's renewable energy, you can take the same renewable energy that is used to power something that sucks carbon out of the air, use that to replace a coal plant, and you will reduce more CO2 by taking the same renewable energy to replace the coal plant. But in addition to replacing the coal plant, you'll eliminate the air pollution from the coal, the mining from the coal, the infrastructure from the coal, if you use renewable energy to replace a coal plant. Using renewable energy to power direct air capture or carbon capture, all it does is try to reduce carbon, and so that it doesn't reduce any air pollution, any mining, or anything else. And so the social cost benefit of using renewables to replace fossil fuels is so much higher than just the social cost benefit is so much higher than using it to try to capture carbon. One more example I'll give with regard to nuclear power. So a lot of people are really strong on nuclear power. Because there's only been one nuclear power plant built in the United States in the last 20 years, and 2 reactors are being built in Georgia. And one of them may come online in the next few months. But the cost of that, it's been 18 years from planning to operation of those 2 nuclear reactors. They've cost $35 billion for 2.23 gigawatts. That is $15.6 per watt. To put it in perspective, and that took 18 years for $15.6 per watt, 2.3 gigawatts. Remember those numbers. In the last 3 months, well, the first quarter of 2023, there was, worldwide, there were 26 gigawatts of wind built. The cost was $15.2 billion. That's $0.6 a watt versus $15.5 a watt for the nuclear. The wind was built with a planning to operation time of 1 to 3 years versus 18 years for these Georgia plants. So in other words, you could take the same $35 billion from the nuclear spent on those Georgia plants, and you would have gotten 26 times more wind from that same 26 times more peak power and 10 times more average power. And it would have gotten 15 years faster. In addition to all the other problems saved from nuclear, which, there's weapons proliferation risk, mining risk, waste risk, meltdown risk, etc. Anyway, so my point is we need to focus. We have so little time. We need to focus on what works, implement things as rapidly as possible, and not get distracted by technologies that we know aren't going to work. And so we'll stop there.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll get us started with one question, and then we'll take it from there. As you can see, you, TJ, and Mark come from very different disciplines, from very different perspectives. And when I look at your work, one thing that cuts across both of your work is this idea of perceived impossibility. In art, there was, for a while now, this idea of closure, of representation, like it is impossible to capture climate collapse in an image, in a song, in a narrative. There has been that idea going around for a long time, and in your work you demonstrate that that's apparently not the case, and abundantly so. And likewise, in your work, Mark, you work with all of these data and with all of these technologies, and you demonstrate clearly over and over again that yes, we have 90% or 95% of technological solutions, and yet there is this idea that, oh, we need a miracle breakthrough in technology in order to solve climate crisis. So again, there is that idea of perceived impossibility of addressing the problem. So why don't we start now with you, if you can address this question, and then hopefully we can engage in a dialogue.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so the idea that climate change poses representational challenges is really significant. And before I get into that, I just want to reflect on what Mark was just saying, because I think for me, this has been really important to hear that kind of the options that he's putting on the table so powerfully. And one conclusion that I've taken away from this in the past is that really climate change meaningful approaches to mitigating climate change, it's not a technological challenge so much as it is a political challenge. At least that's my takeaway. Like, why aren't we doing those things? Why aren't we making those transitions? Why aren't we restructuring the energy grid in all the ways that Mark is talking about? And for me, like, I've always operated under the understanding that it's politics, basically. There are vested interests that are benefiting tremendously from the fossil fuel economy. And we know that just in the last few months, hearing the reports from oil industry corporations, just how much money people are making these days. That represents ultimately a political challenge, especially when we know how these corporations have extreme amounts of influence within the political process. But turning to the question of the representational issue, yeah, so there's a couple sources for me of this argument. One is the work of Amitav Ghosh, who wrote a book called The Great Derangement a few years ago. It came out in 2017. And he's thinking a lot about literature and making the argument that climate change is not just an ecological challenge, it's also a symptom of a cultural failure, that we haven't had the representational resources to really think about, imagine, and talk about this within culture at large. So he's calling for a new kind of literature, an eco-literature, if you will, that can begin to address this and provide a means to have interdisciplinary, cross-cultural, international conversations about what climate change is, what the stakes are, how can we think about different kinds of approaches and solutions. That's one. The other is the philosopher. I'm sure there's others, but the other one that comes to mind for me is Timothy Morton and his idea of hyperobjects, which is maybe one of the most widely cited terms within the environmental humanities. And his idea is that climate change is part of this category of objectivity that is so expanded in terms of space and time that it just transcends the human capacity to understand it. And it is consequently, in some ways, problematically, it leads to the conclusion that what we're dealing with is just not understandable. And I think that is really debilitating and ultimately false, and something that we should resist, and also resist on political grounds. Because if we're dedicating ourselves to thinking about the unthinkable, ultimately this leads to kind of vicious circle where we don't really get anywhere. And similarly with Amitav Ghosh's proposal, I think it's self-limiting insofar as he's looking at what he calls serious fiction, when he's not looking at, for instance, science fiction, where there's long histories of thinking about climate transformation in really fascinating ways, from Ursula Le Guin to Kim Stanley Robinson, N.K. Jemisin, indigenous fiction. There's lots of resources within the arts, and including within the visual arts, within the last couple decades. Internationally, within my research, I've found just innumerable artists who are attempting to represent and think about and imagine not only the reality of climate catastrophe, but also analyzing it in very critical, conceptual ways, using documentary approaches, relying on technology from satellite remote sensing data to increasingly AI and all sorts of cybernetic approaches to understanding and thinking about climate change. So it's just it's not really the case that we lack representational cultures of thinking about this. What I do, it does beg the question though, why aren't all these artistic approaches entering into the discussion? And I can't, for me, again, thinking about some of my work and the artists that I'm looking at, it's not unrelated, I think, to the fact that arts and culture increasingly are subjected to these conditions of commodification and enclosure within extremely commercial arts institutions. For instance, when the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art is charging $25 for admissions just to enter the museum, this tells you something about how rarefied and exclusive the discussion is about contemporary culture. So when it comes to thinking about the limitations of representation and the role that culture can play in this, we have to ask the question, well, maybe that's a result of this kind of enclosure, this kind of rarefication of cultural experience, so that it's not really offering any opportunity to have more large-scale, inclusive discussions. And it's also a result of this bubble economy, which technology in general is producing these days, especially through social media and all of that. So I think we have to ask really difficult questions in terms of how we get at and think about and how this kind of information that Mark was just presenting about engineering approaches to transforming the energy grid and dealing with emissions and climate change. How does this get out in terms of communication, in terms of discussions and representation? Those become key questions within this media ecosystem of fake news, of algorithmic governance, of recommendation algorithms, and basically the commodification of information that ultimately tends to support vested interests in looking at climate change from certain vantage points that reaffirm basically fossil capitalist interests.
Mark.
So, well, there was a public opinion poll a few years ago. It was among 13 countries, about 26,000 people, and they asked the question, how many of you believe in renewable energy, or how many would support a 100% renewable energy transition? And it was very consistent across every country. The answer, it was close to around 82%. So 82% of people across 13 countries, and all these people believed in 100% renewable energy. The same poll, they asked how many people believe in global warming, and it was about 66%. So there are a lot more people who believed in renewable energy than believed in global warming. Then they asked additional questions. Well, why do you believe in renewable energy? And some people said, well, it provides energy security. Other people thought it can create jobs. You can own your own energy. And a lot of people thought it could also improve air pollution health problems. Well, the moral of this story is, it's great if you believe in the solution but don't believe in the problem. It's fine with me, because what we need is a transition to renewable energy. We don't care if you actually believe in global warming or not. And so I think so that comes back to your question. I don't think we need to represent climate change, because first of all, we need to focus on the solution. But air pollution, this is also a reason I look at air pollution, because a lot of people will actually can grasp onto air pollution. They can't grasp on to climate change. Because a lot of people don't see the impacts of climate change right in front of them. But many more people do see air pollution, or they know somebody with asthma, or somebody who's had serious problems with air pollution. And especially, I mean, in the U.S., we've cleaned up our air quite a bit. I mean, there are about 80,000 deaths per year and hundreds of thousands of illnesses in the U.S. compared to 7 million worldwide. And California is still about 13,000 deaths per year, and Los Angeles is still the epicenter of U.S. air pollution. But except so in the California, you can still see in the Central Valley and Southern California, but in most of the U.S. you don't see it a lot, even though it's there. But the rest of the world, you do see it in every big city. So I think focusing on the pollution problems, because if you can solve the pollution problem, you're also solving the climate problem simultaneously. And also just focusing on the solution and not, you don't want to alienate a third of the people just by, trying to pester them about climate change. Interestingly, this, in the United States, wind energy, you probably never guess which state actually provides the greatest fraction of its generation of electricity from just wind and water and solar. It's South Dakota. South Dakota provides 84% of its electricity from just wind and hydropower, with 54% wind and around 30% hydropower. And in terms of consumption, it supplies 120% of its consumption from wind and hydropower and exports the difference. And who's second, third, and fourth? Well, there's Vermont, and then there's Iowa. Iowa's got about 67% wind, and then there's Idaho. And in fact, if you look at the 9 of the 10 top wind states in terms of the highest fraction of their electricity from wind, they're all states that have no policies to go towards renewable energy. They're all what we call red states, because they're all in the Great Plains, because the cost of wind is so low. Solar is also extremely low, and that's starting to catch on as well. So, and then there are 19 states that have laws to go to 100% renewables, but only one of those states, California, actually is in the top 10 in terms of the highest fraction of electricity from wind. So it's really a combination of having policies, but also having low costs. And that's what drives things. So I think focus on the solution. And I don't think we should waste our time trying to convince people that climate change is real. We know it's real, for most of us do already.
That blows my mind. You just blow my mind right here. Iowa, North Dakota. You would think California or New York State. I want to open it up for you, if you have questions for each other. I have questions for you, but yeah.
One of the questions that I'm trying to bring to the table, I suppose, is what do we do in relationship, not so much to the technological challenges, but the challenges of political power? What does it mean that we have extremely wealthy people who are invested in the fossil fuel economy? I'm sure you've thought about this. What would your proposals be for how to not only provide roadmaps for engineering solutions, but what about the political steps to get us there?
Yeah, well, I think it does take everybody. I think the first thing is education. I mean, a lot of people are not aware of the ability to transition to entirely renewable energy. So first is getting more information out on a large scale, and hopefully that'll permeate to these wealthy people who have a lot of money invested in fossil fuels. I think they know. I think most people know fossil fuel life is limited, but they're just trying to squeeze it to the last minute. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people who have a good intention, who are investing, who are also wealthy people who try to invest in renewables. But unfortunately, with the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S., which is largely good, 60% of the funds are going towards good solutions, so things I've talked about, but 40% of the funds are also going towards these bad solutions, the carbon capture, direct air capture, small modular reactors, blue hydrogen, electrofuels. And so we really need to educate the policymakers about why these proposed solutions are not going to help in the time frame we need, and also are not going to help with pollution or energy security. So I think it's first and foremost education, but also I think as we transition towards renewables with more electric cars, more renewables on the grid, I think there is an exponential growth that's going to happen. I mean, right now we have in the U.S. 5.7% of all our vehicles are electric, but it was just 2 or 3 years ago, it was like 1%. So it's actually grown, and I think it will grow exponentially. And the more people have electric cars, they'll realize the benefits of them. The fact that you will save $24,000 if the price of gasoline is $4 a gallon, well, the cost of driving your electric car is 80 cents a gallon equivalent. So you save $24,000 if you drive an average of 15,000 miles a year for 15 years. And most people will realize this, over time. And the more people who are driving electric cars, I think they tell their neighbors, and you have more examples of how not only it saves money in fuel, but it also is safer, fewer repairs, accelerates better. People learn, and you'll get a faster transition that way. So I think it's partly, as we get to a certain point, we'll see a rapid growth just because people realize how good this is.
Is it rapid enough?
No, not on its own. We do need strong policies to be put in place, aggressive policies. Like right now, the Biden administration has 50% goal, 50% new electric cars by 2030. I mean, we need 80% new electric cars by 2030. So that's not fast enough. And we basically need an 80% transition of everything by 2030.
Another question for both of you. So one of the things that really comes powerfully from your presentation, TJ, is this social justice framework for all of this work on climate change. And what comes from your presentation, Mark, is really the iron logic of really technologies that are already economically viable. So there is this idea of economic affordability and social framework for the solutions that we need. Is there any way they come together? To what degree is social justice framework that you are talking about also addressing this kind of informed by this kind of economic issues? And to what degree we can think in terms of these solutions about social justice?
Yeah, I think they not only can they come together, they have to come together. I think that's part of the urgency of the situation. Will they? That's a big question. I'm not saying that they necessarily will. They have to. They should. Certainly, education. I agree. Education is a huge part of it. In Santa Cruz, for instance, we have a youth-led organization called Youth for Climate Justice, and they're demanding. One of their demands, beyond decarbonization in general, is to integrate a climate component to the curriculum in grade school, which currently isn't a requirement. I mean, which is shocking in some ways. We're in the face of this civilization-threatening catastrophe, and this stuff is not even being taught in grade school. Not only that, there's not a requirement in the University of California system at UCSC. There's no requirement that a student takes classes in this. So, we're in a situation now where education isn't even part of the equation. So clearly we have to move in that direction. And I agree, like that represents questions of time. Can we move fast enough? One reason for my doubt about this issue of can we bring social justice together with technology through policy choices. If you look at the debt agreement that's currently being agreed on right now, maybe some of you have followed this. The part of the debt agreement is to fast track Joe Manchin's proposal for the Mountain Valley Pipeline project, right? This is disaster. This is further investment in fossil fuels. Chuck Schumer, New York Senator, he's received almost $300,000 in campaign donations from a corporation, Next Era, that is heavily invested in the Mountain Valley Pipeline. So you start to see the connections between the political process and the corporations. So can this happen? Well, my stark opinion about this would be, you can't ultimately have social justice and capitalism. They just won't go together. We need really structural transformation in the systems to enact the kind of just transition that we're considering right now. So I think that couldn't be clearer. Otherwise, we have the continual interests of people who are trying to, basically solidify their economic value and their wealth accumulation by benefiting from these conditions of catastrophe. That's why we have technological proposals like carbon capture and geoengineering. So it's, I think that this is where the crucial point of intersection between social justice and technology has to direct itself toward a political struggle that requires social movement energy, requires labor militancy, requires participation of everyone, because everyone ultimately is a stakeholder in the future of the planet. So we hear, the question of renewable energy is major, but what does it mean currently, for instance, in California, when labor conditions are much better? There's a higher degree of union density, which offers a more quality standard of living within the fossil fuel industry than in the renewable industry, which has a very low density of union organizing. Like that is a policy area which needs to be transformed. Unfortunately, we're living at a time of where the political class is largely dedicated to decimating labor and guaranteeing corporate profits. This is really the bind that we're in right now.
Well, so I view a transition to 100% renewable, it has to be for 100% of the people. And in our vision of a transformation, it will benefit 100% of the people. Not only, well, first of all, in terms of air pollution, I mean, where are a lot of sources of air pollution? They're near poor neighborhoods, right? So as we're going to, and there's a lot of fossil fuel mining near such neighborhoods and also refineries. And we're going to eliminate all this infrastructure and all the mining of fossil fuels. We're going to eliminate continuous mining of all fuels. And that's one of the benefits, another benefit of such a transition is we no longer have to mine, transport, or refine fossil fuels or uranium. And 11 to 12% of all energy worldwide is used for that purpose, just for that mining, transporting, refining these fossil fuels. In the US alone, we dig 50,000 new oil and gas wells every year. There are 1.3 million active oil and gas wells, 3.2 million abandoned ones. The entire fossil fuel industry occupies 1.3% of US land area and is growing by 50,000 new wells every year. And this, if we transition to renewable energy, like just wind and solar, we will go down to about 0.9% of US land area, and it won't grow. So that's the first benefit, and that you'll see this benefit in terms of reduced air pollution and reduced land damage in poor communities. And so this is how this will benefit not only everybody, but in particular people who are least can afford a transition. In addition, jobs will be created. I mean, from our own calculations worldwide, we'd create 28 million more long-term full-time jobs than lost. In the US, it's about 3 to 4 million. There are some states that will lose jobs, but more states will gain more jobs. So in terms of job creation, air pollution reduction, land use reduction, that'll benefit everybody. And there's also another component is the cost reduction. I mean, not only is the cost per unit energy, I gave you the example with wind versus nuclear power, but the cost per unit energy is expected to go down in the future more. But more importantly, when we electrify all energy, we use a lot less energy. In fact, we use worldwide about 56% less energy for 5 reasons. One is the one I mentioned about we no longer mine, transport, and refine fossil fuels and uranium. That's about 11 to 12%. Another is because electric heat pumps use 1/4 the energy as natural gas or fuel oil combustion heating. And so you replace all the home and business heating with heat pumps for air and water heating and also air conditioning, you eliminate a huge amount of energy there. That's on the order of 15% of all energy worldwide. Going to electric vehicles, they use 1/4 to 1/5 the energy as a gasoline or diesel vehicle. So you eliminate about 20% more energy there. And then energy efficiency improvements beyond business as usual, and also electrifying industry. If you sum that all up, it's about 56% worldwide reduction of demand for energy. And so you just need a lot less energy to run things. And so even if the cost per unit energy were the same, your overall annual costs go down 56%. So you have cost reductions, you have land use reductions, you have job creation, air pollution reductions, and reduced climate damage. That's going to benefit everybody, and so that'll help a just transition.
Mark, we need your optimism. Thank you so much. Let's open it up for audience. There is a question. Please wait for the mic. We're making an audio recording, so it would be great if everyone could speak into the microphone.
Thanks. I just had a question for Mark. I wondered in your work how you account for mining and all of the resources that we still need to extract in order to get to full electrification and everything literally from the wires to the machines. I mean, mining is very fossil fuel intensive right now.
Yeah, well, in terms of doing the mining, all these mines will be 100% renewable. I mean, our goal is to electrify industry. So mines use electricity and use heavy equipment like vehicles. So those will all be battery electric or some hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, and all the electricity will be electric. But as I mentioned, if we look at the total mining today of fossil fuels and uranium and also metals for renewables and stuff like that, and we look at what we need for renewables, we only need mining for renewables for the infrastructure, not for the continuous fuel. Whereas for fossil fuels, you need mining for both the infrastructure and the fuels. And the continuous daily mining for the energy portion for fossil fuels is about 99.9% of the mining. So we're going to reduce the mass of mining about 99.9%. So we will have additional mining, sure, but it's going to be about 0.1% of the current mining. In terms of the actual substances like lithium, for example, I mean, lithium is recycled. Batteries are recycled. Sonnen is a battery company. They recycle 100% of the components of their batteries. Redwood Materials is a company started by J.B. Straubel from Tesla, who they recycle not only batteries, but they're also doing solar panels, and they're recycling 97% of the components. So even with batteries, once you've mined it, it's going to be reused over and over and over again. So it's a one-time investment. But the mining issue is a red herring. That is a trivial amount of mining that we'll need in comparison to what we're doing right now. There's not 50,000 new oil and gas wells every year in the U.S. We'll need maybe 3 or 4 lithium mines. The Salton Sea alone can provide lithium for 40% of all the world. And that Salton Sea already has geothermal electricity production there, and they bring up a brine that contains lithium and other elements, and that's already mined, and lithium is now being extracted from that, so that's no additional mining for new lithium too.
There is a question there.
Hi, Mark. So I think that storage is very important to get fossil fuels off the grid. And I've been a big proponent of bidirectional electric vehicle charging, where you charge during the day, because currently in California, we shed lots of solar and wind energy and don't let it onto the grid because we don't have enough demand. So we charge during the day, and then in evenings, everyone goes home and turns on their electric appliances and uses their cars to power the grid and their homes. So given that EVs, we're going to have the EVs, they sit unused 95% of the time, I think it's super important we use their batteries instead of trying to produce more batteries solely for grid storage, because we don't have the battery manufacturing capability to do both within the time frame we need to. For commercial and industrial purposes, there's bidirectional EV charging. The utilities aren't terribly happy about it. Mostly people have to work with virtual power plants. The CPUC is slowly introducing regulations to get utilities to accept power and to communicate with people's equipment to demand the power from the car to the grid. I'm wondering, why aren't we seeing these home bidirectional EV chargers rolling out more quickly? And what can we do to encourage car manufacturers and utilities and regulators to get on the ball so that we can get rid of our gas peaker plants every evening?
Yeah, so it's also called vehicle to grid, bidirectional charging. But in Europe, there are some cities that have actually done experiments where they're doing this on a larger scale. And there are some companies that have committed to that, to trying that. I mean, the main issue, so it works, and it's a great idea. In theory, you have to have buy-in for owners of cars, first of all, so that's one issue. The second issue, there's also the option of, so you have the option of like, charging your home or powering your home with your car, but there's also the option of charging your car, letting the grid operators charge your car when it's ideal for that. And the advantage of that is every time you put electricity in your car or take it out, there's a loss of electricity, especially car chargers. I mean, some car chargers, these are the most efficient ones, you can lose up to 35% of the electricity with car charging. You know, more efficient ones, maybe 5% or 6%. Discharging is only a couple percent, but you know, going in and out of batteries, there's a loss of electricity. And also, the more cycles you go through by doing this, you're going to also wear down your batteries faster. Although there are some batteries now that, you know, they're 15,000 cycles they're warranted for, so they last pretty long. So, you know, owners of cars are kind of squeamish about, you know, using, you know, those cycles on their car, and they might have to, at one point, replace their battery in their car. Having said that, yeah, in theory, it does work. It's great. It's just a question of if it can get implemented on a large scale, and in comparison to the other options available.
There was a question right there.
Just follow up. I've only encountered 2 studies talking about battery degradation, and they find it's less with vehicle to grid than with casual charging from transportation purposes, because the vehicle is plugged in most of the time when it's not charging, and therefore you don't cycle it as deeply as you would if you drive it for a week and then recharge it. So they've actually found in practice there's less battery degradation.
I wanted to get your perspective on how far do you think we are from clean fusion energy? You know, it's a topic. A lot of people have looked into this, and of course, companies are investing in this. And just wanted to get your perspective on this.
Well, so all electricity from nuclear today is from fission, or splitting atoms. So fusion is when they're merging together, and I'm just going to say it doesn't exist at any commercial scale, so we're not interested in it, because we need to implement things right now that are commercial and that can be implemented quickly, such as wind and solar. And the only evidence of electricity generation, I mean, almost all these experiments with fusion have indicated they've used more energy than they've produced, and even the one that claims that they produce more energy than they use. It was a trivial amount of energy for a huge energy input, and the cost was enormous, and then it has not been able to, it's recently been found that they could not replicate that. So it doesn't exist in my mind. So it's something we shouldn't waste our time on things that don't exist and have no hope of being commercially viable in the next 5 to 10 years. And I think, you know, people are going to still work on it, but, you know, it's always 10 to 20 years away, and it's too far away, and it doesn't even make sense how they can commercialize it on a scale that we would need in comparison. You can't get 50 cents per watt capital cost of that. It's just not even in the cards.
I just want to interject with a question about what you mentioned, TJ, techno fixes. So there are all of these things that can be fixed, that can be adjusted, and all of that. But another thing that came from both your presentation and your Mark is basically the lack of oversight in investment of these huge companies like Metaverse investing billions of dollars. Who's paying for that? Or carbon capture. So that's, I think, one huge part of the problem. So in what way, I want to return the conversation to this exchange between technology and arts. How can we call attention to these kinds of questions and not only focus on techno fixes? In artists that you are working on, what kind of ideas are emerging there?
Well, generally, I think there's a prevailing skepticism about solutionism. That is based on the idea that we can just dedicate ourselves to solutions and believe that they will be enacted. Like I don't know. I've been researching environmental arts for I don't know about 15 years now, and involved with environmental activism for similar, maybe a little bit longer of a time. And I think I don't think it's really arguable. Things are getting worse. Things in that time we haven't had a growth of, or an advancement that's ideas led toward a post-carbon transformation. I don't know what you think about this, Mark, but things actually seem to be getting worse with UN climate governance, with the climate summits that are happening on a yearly basis. We have more and more agreements. Generally, they're non-binding. They're not really doing anything. Emissions are growing. We're getting worse. So when Mark says we need to have 100% decarbonization by 2050, right? That's to keep us below 1.5 or
Yeah.
I mean, like that seems really hard to imagine that could actually happen. So it's not that I don't support that, but I think within the arts, at least the arts that I'm attentive to and researching, that are generally dedicated to social justice, ways of thinking about climate that are decolonial or anti-colonial or racially just. Like, how do we integrate those questions to get more people on board to argue for this in the face of just mounting resistance and institutional inertia and vested interests? It's really hard to come away from that analysis with any kind of positivity.
Yeah, I'm more optimistic because, even the IPCC report that just came out, they've pushed a lot of carbon capture in there, but why? It's because the summary report to policymakers, Saudi Arabia required it, otherwise they weren't going to sign on. So they basically pushed carbon capture into the front page of the IPCC report. So that's where politics.
And the next climate summit is in Dubai.
Yeah. But having said that, there are 9 countries in the world that are 100% wind, water, and solar, and there are 30 countries that are over 50%. So they're granted they're all smaller countries, but that's encouraging. And then there is this growth. The fact that things are so cheap and they're coming down in terms of the cost is really that really gives me hope.
Yes.
Thank you very much. And as Mark mentioned about the IPCC report, I also want to bring up because they estimated about half of the carbon emission reductions can be achieved through the demand side. And so I feel like tonight it would be great to discuss about the demand side, because the conversation seems like it's more about to assume the demand is fixed and how to address the challenges through the supply side. But the demand side has a great opportunities because there are different ways to reduce. For example, Toyota reduce their energy use for producing cars and by 75% over about decade time. And so there are also opportunities. For example, we can see how much energy we can reduce by, for example, if it's not naturally using AC and we don't have to use it. So there are so many different ways can reduce energy use, and we don't have to, even the renewable energy is still, for example, solar panel, it also requires the space, right? Sometimes even can compete the land. So it still will require resources. And also it links to TG's point about the art. There are also great potential how to help consumers understand and how to transform the norm, the social norm, the culture. So I think there is a potential link here, but we haven't discussed much yet. So it would be great to have your thoughts about that. Thank you very much.
Well, what you can do to reduce demand the most, you can, if you have a gas stove, replace it immediately with an electric induction, and that'll save you 60% of your energy, because electric induction burns evenly and you don't have all this heat loss that you do with this gas stove. And it's about a 60% saving. Next, get a heat pump for air air heating and water heating. That'll save 75% of your energy from your heating. Electric vehicles will save 75% of your energy from fuel. So all those, just changing your technologies is one way to reduce the demand for energy substantially, not a little bit. These are huge reductions. But then also, LED lights, energy. So going to more energy efficient appliances, more efficient refrigerators, LED lights, weatherizing your home, putting weather stripping is very low-hanging fruit, low-cost way to do it. But then also, telecommuting more rather than driving, of course, all the things we can do to reduce energy. So that's all part of the solution, but you'll get a natural reduction just by electrifying everything.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I would agree with all that, and point out that there's lots of people that just are living hand to mouth or even worse. The amount of precarity in the world these days makes it so that it's really hard for many people to even consider converting in all those ways that are kind of like individual-led forms of climate mitigation on that basis. And I think they are important and they do add up. But we also have to talk about the question, do we want to just take our present economy and cultural conditions and way of life and transition it to renewable energy, to a renewable energy grid, or do we need to talk about how we should be consuming less? Do we need to talk about degrowth? And then do we need also to talk about, well, who is going to degrow, and who needs to grow more? Who needs more resources? Who needs more public transportation, affordable housing, healthcare, right? How can we grow systems that respond to the majority, and how will they help people? So I think the question of degrowth or selective smart degrowth is really a crucial one. Equitable degrowth is absolutely so important, and that is coming up a lot within more humanities or arts-based discussions of climate and climate justice. And then I'll just throw in one last thing. Mark mentioned some viable solutions or ways of addressing this that I think are really important, but there's a real sense of desperation about running up against just the seeming impossibility of political transformation that's leading some people who are leaders within the climate justice movement internationally to basically say, look, we've had 2 decades of climate movement politics that are basically failing. Like, we have not achieved the goals of international climate justice that were set out for the last couple decades or so. And now people are starting to ask, well, what can we do differently? What can we do otherwise? And I'm thinking about Extinction Rebellion, Sunrise, 350.org, Greenpeace, and more. And increasingly, there's one way is, well, how can we address degrowth politics that doesn't presume that everyone needs to degrow? In other words, that doesn't read as more austerity if you're coming from a working class or a global south perspective. Like, right, how can we think about growth in different nuanced, complex ways? So that's one thing. How can we come up with a kind of working class Green New Deal to get more people on board globally? And then the other thing, which I think is really concerning and needs to be thought about a lot more, is a book like Andreas Malm's How to Blow Up a Pipeline, right? This kind of consideration is coming back. Like, what does it mean to think that we've reached the end of representational political options and we need to consider, within the climate movements of social activism, we need to consider more aggressive tactics? Like the kind of stuff that we're seeing within, say, sectors of cultural practice that are also social movement based, like Just Stop Oil, or The Last Generation in Germany, or the organization around Cop City in Atlanta. Like, how can we integrate conditions of policing and the security state and US militarism and imperialism into the question of climate justice? And what does it mean to suggest that sabotage is a necessary step towards stopping the madness that is seemingly uncontrollably advancing us toward climate chaos? So I don't know what the answer is there, but it's stuff that's coming up increasingly these days, and I think it's a symptom of the desperation that we're in right now politically.
Thank you. We started a little bit late, so we have time for one more question. So wherever the mic is, that will be our last question.
Well, great. That's pretty amazing. I get the last question. So I'm going to mix it up a little bit. TJ, this is for you. Given Hollywood's enormous potential at having global influence, how much have you, your colleagues, scientists, other academics, interacted with writers, directors, and producers to explain the realities of climate change and the just transition?
Actually, that's also for Mark.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it goes along with what Mark raised as the imperative of education, and an educational transformation that is not symbolically or performatively about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but really meaningfully, like substantially and distributively. Like, how can we think of an education that will argue for the necessity of redistributing resources for climate justice? I personally have had no contact with like people within the Hollywood industry, but I've followed it pretty closely from my perspective and interest in environmental or eco-cinema, or experimental, independent approaches to imagining climate futures. And I think, unfortunately, much of Hollywood and independent film production, when it comes to addressing, proposals for a just transition, pretty much fail. And there's just a endless seduction of climate dystopia. I think that makes a certain amount of sense because it's really entertaining in many ways, just to imagine, well, what will the apocalypse be like in the near future? Whether it's the zombie apocalypse or extreme weather events or tsunamis or whatever it may be. And from my analysis, I see, this is how I understand it, Hollywood as a function is invested, and I think they are ideologically and I think they are financially, in repeatedly reminding us that there is no other alternative than what we're in now, the kind of dominant economic system that we're in now. So it's like that Thatcherite dictate, there is no alternative. And I think that's false, and I think it's something that we really need to reject. And in many ways, I think it's a function of, again, these vested interests, that there is real economic profit to be made through what Naomi Klein calls disaster capitalism. So we're faced with a situation where the media industry, in many ways, is encouraging this commitment to like a Mad Max future. And I think it's white supremacist, it's racist, it's extractivist, it's colonial, it's imperialist. This is exactly what we need to resist. And the fact that someone like Elon Musk is in charge of Twitter, and says something about the coup a few years ago in Bolivia that some people refer to as a lithium coup, where he tweeted, "We can coup whoever we want, deal with it," is really symptomatic of this condition of the culture industry and how it's invested in climate chaos.
And Mark has a different example on that point.
Yeah, we need more. Now we need some optimism.
Well, funny you should ask, because in 2011, I helped co-founded a nonprofit called the Solutions Project with Mark Ruffalo, who's an actor and activist as well. And he was working in New York fighting against hydrofracking. And also Josh Fox, who was a director of the movie Gasland, which was nominated for an Academy Award, which actually uncovered what fracking really was. And also then another guy, Marco Krapels, who's a business person. So this nonprofit, it kind of combined science, business, culture, and community. And it was together, we were developing energy plans for states and countries here at Stanford. And the rest of these guys, and also we engaged lots of other people, but also other nonprofits. In fact, at one point we had 100 nonprofits supporting us, including all the ones you just mentioned, who, when we really together energized this 100% renewable energy movement, and we got laws passed in the state of New York. We got a 50% renewables law that eventually went to 100% renewables, SB 100 in California was based on these plans and the advocacy of all these groups. And eventually the Green New Deal came out of it. But it was only because, nobody would listen to me, because I just, write a paper and, has a lifetime of a week or two, and then it disappears. But when you combine, writing science papers and then getting the information out with a bunch of people who are really a loud voice, it just makes a huge difference. And this is what happened, is this, it really galvanized this entire movement. And we ended up getting laws in 19 states and territories in the US to go to 100% renewables. The Sierra Club joined and went to cities, got 180 cities to commit to 100% renewables. We got 400 international companies, including 8 of the 10 biggest companies in the world, to commit to 100% renewables, and 62 countries. And this was all because of this combination of the science, business, culture, and community. And it wasn't all of Hollywood, but it helped, because then Leo DiCaprio got on board too, and he helped us, got us into the United Nations. And we presented, and he even came here to interview our students for a documentary, and it was just like it was just opened up a lot of doors to be able to help get this transition off the ground and get it publicized.
This is a fascinating discussion, but we all have to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Mark, TJ. This was amazing. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah.